Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I want to welcome you to First Tuesday. For those of you who I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, I'm Jamie Prenkert. I am, as of 36 days ago, the Dean of the Carlson School of Management. Thank you. So it's a special treat for me to be here and to host my First Tuesday event, ironically on the second Tuesday of August. Nonetheless, it's an honor to be carrying on the tradition of this monthly event, which dates all the way back to 1992. So today begins a new season for our First Tuesday speaker series, and we'll be joined by Jeff Harmening of General Mills. But before we get to Jeff, I want to recognize First Tuesday's longtime corporate and media partners, Wells Fargo and Twin Cities Business. And of course, I want to extend a very special thank you to the many Carlson School of Management and University of Minnesota supporters in our audience today. And of particular note, I'd like to welcome Regent Doug Hipsch and Dean Andrew Aline of the College of Science and Engineering. So Dean Aline was the chair of my search committee, so I'm particularly excited to be connected again with him. But I want to say welcome to Regent Hipsch and thank you to Dean Aline. Thank you also to our benefactors joining us today, including our Investors Circle. The Investors Circle is the Carlson School's annual giving society recognizing our most ardent and committed individual supporters. Welcome to you all. So I'm very excited today to introduce today's featured speaker, Jeffrey Harmening. Jeff is CEO and chairman of the board of directors at General Mills. He joined General Mills in 1994 and has held leadership positions for the company in the United States and Europe. Jeff previously served as president and chief operating officer for General Mills, where he shaped strategies for the company's 4 global operating segments and had oversight for the global supply chain, as well as innovation, technology, and quality. He's also worked as the executive vice president and chief operating officer for the largest division of General Mills, the U.S. retail segment. In that role, he had corporate oversight of divisions such as Big G Cereals, Pillsbury USA, and Yoplait, among others. As an aside, I have to say, Jeff, that last night I was telling my wife about this conversation we were going to have, and she got super excited and ran into the next room and pulled out a box. We moved here about a month ago, and we're still unpacking. And she said, the other day, I found the box in which were the toys, the Pillsbury Doughboy family, her favorite toys from when she was a kid that she still cherishes today. And out of all of your many accomplishments, being the boss of the Pillsbury Doughboy was indeed her most impressed situation. So Jeff is a graduate of DePauw University in my home state of Indiana and received his MBA from Harvard. And last and maybe most importantly, Jeff is married to a Carlson School alum, Lisa. We're so proud to count you as an MBA graduate and particularly have a warm welcome for you today as well. And with that, please join me in welcoming Jeff Harmening.
You got quiet. I mean,
Yeah.
I had the sense before you came up we were interrupting a family gathering. And
Well, we're set to have a bit of a fireside chat here, and it's great to have you back with us for the First Tuesday series. For those of you in the room who haven't had the pleasure of hearing you speak at this kind of gathering, either a prior First Tuesday or someplace else, we'll have this conversation, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience in a little bit. But just to start out with, if you could tell us a bit about your background and your role at General Mills.
Yeah, so, I know in this community, General Mills doesn't need a big introduction, but I mean, I think a little bit of history. It goes back to 1866 on the banks of the Mississippi River here, and it's a $20 billion company today, and importantly, 9 brands with $1 billion of sales each. And you mentioned Pillsbury, which is our largest brand, Blue Buffalo, also a $1 billion brand, brands like Cheerios, and Totino's and Yoplait and Nature Valley. I see a lot of heads nodding. Mm-hmm. We're in like 97% of cupboards in the United States. And so, it's a company with a long legacy, and I'm honored to be the CEO. I started my career after business school, and I had been at Eli Lilly and Company before, and Lilly is a great company as well, good corporate values. I was in finance, and I decided after coming out of business school that even though I love Lilly, finance probably wasn't in my cards, and specifically accounting. Okay. And it turns out in accounting, the left side and the right side always have to equal, and getting to that level of detail escaped me. And so coming out of business school, I turned down the chance to stay with Lilly, and they had paid my way through business school and took an offer for less money to do what I really wanted to do, which was marketing, and market some of the world's greatest brands. And so that was 29 years ago. As you said in the introduction, I've done a lot of things since then. And I get asked a lot of times, when did you think you were going to become CEO? And it's interesting. I had a conversation with an outside person doing some testing, some personality trait testing, and they asked me a question. They said, do you want to be the CEO of General Mills? And I mean, it was clearly supposed to be a right answer. Unfortunately, on this testing, it's called the Hogan analysis. I tested as pretty mischievous, and so I said no. And I mean, the look on this guy's face was like, that was clearly not what I was supposed to say. And I quickly followed it up with the truth, which is my aspiration actually was never to be the CEO. It was always to create value wherever I worked. And I said, but if I'm fortunate enough to become CEO, I want to be a good one. Because for me, it wasn't enough to get the title. That wasn't actually the goal. The goal was to try to add value and make a difference wherever I was. And I also say fortunate because, it takes some skill to get to the job that I have, but it takes a lot more luck. Because it's a matter of timing in the right place and succession and all the rest of these things. And so I really do feel fortunate because the timing worked out, but also it's such a great company.
Well, thanks. There's a lot, I think, to unpack there and to talk about and to follow up. But I want to first take a step sort of back in time. And you and I, Jeff, share Hoosier roots.
Yes, we do.
And both of us grew up in Indiana. And I first learned about business from my mom, who owned a sewing machine and fabric store in the tiny little town in northern Indiana we grew up in. Mm-hmm. And a few weeks ago, when you and I were having a conversation, you mentioned how you learned some really formative lessons from your own mother.
I did.
And so I wondered if you could say a bit about what those are, other formative experiences you had that have sort of stayed with you as you've moved into leadership and into your business career.
Yeah, sure. And my mom has made a big impression, as is my dad, and I'll talk a little bit about both of them. But my mom was the executive in my family. And any of you who have met my mom, I would say she was a force, but she still is a force. Sure. And she's going to be 84 next month, and she still reads the Wall Street Journal every day. Wow. And provides feedback on any articles that I happen to be in. Almost all constructive feedback, I would add. And so my mom's, she wanted to be a doctor, but when she was growing up, women weren't doctors. She became a nurse, got her master's in nursing, and got her PhD from Indiana. Oh, so she actually ended up getting her doctorate, and she was the executive in my family. And one of the things I learned about my mom was how much value can be created by having different perspectives. She was the only woman on her leadership team at the hospital where she was an executive. But also how difficult it was to get there and some of the obstacles that she faced. Just one example, the leadership team was having a golf outing, and they decided that they wouldn't invite my mom, but instead my dad. And now my dad was a skilled golfer. He was captain of his college golf team, but that's actually not the point, right? And the point that she was being left out of this, and my mom does play golf. And but she also advocated for herself, and she eventually got on the golf course. And if you knew my mom, you would not be surprised by that. And so, she overcame a lot. But I was always interested in that she could actually given a whole lot more if only given the chance. And and so as we talk about diversity at General Mills and inclusion and belonging, and hopefully we get to that, some of my formative years were about what people have to contribute, if you only give them the chance. But I would also say I learned a lot from my dad as well, because my dad was a college professor, an English professor, and what he always took great joy in my mom's success, and he was never threatened by it. He was always very proud of it, and when my mom was doing her PhD, they were still writing on typewriters at the time, and he was an English professor, so he typed, and I'm pretty sure corrected all the grammar in my mom's thesis. And so I learned a lot from my dad about that, and the power of support and what he gave my mom, and he was never threatened by her success. And I would hope the team at General Mills would feel the same about me, as I want everybody at our company to be successful. And not only am I not threatened by it, I think it says a lot about a leader if the people around you can be successful.
That's great.
Yeah.
So I think by all accounts, the past few years have been challenging ones for businesses to be successful.
Yeah.
And challenging in the way that it's been for all sectors of society, navigating the pandemic, in particular global supply chain issues, more recently the challenges of inflation. And so I wonder if you might say a few words about how you have sort of tried to cultivate that success in the company while weathering these kinds of challenges and any others that you've seen in the last few years.
Yeah, sure. There's no shortage of challenges. We get our officers together, once a year, and we were one of the things we opened the meeting with a list of the challenges over the last 3 years, and pandemic and George Floyd's murder and inflation and supply chain issues, and eventually we got to Brexit, and war in Ukraine. And it wasn't until like the number 5 was Brexit, and what kind of times are we living in when something that monumentous would actually be number 5 on the list? So we've faced a lot. And I use the term "we" often, both in terms of what we face, but also what we have accomplished, because I fundamentally believe that, leadership matters and leaders cast a long shadow, but business is fundamentally a team sport. And you have to have a high-quality team with everybody contributing to be successful. And you ask, and General Mills has been successful through it by a whole number of measures. And the question as to why, I would give you a couple reasons in my view, and I'd be happy to answer questions about this later on. One, as I would say, right before the pandemic hit, we developed our strategy, which we call Accelerate. And I think that's important because we all have, in the midst of change, you need a couple of tent poles to kind of keep you grounded. One was our strategy. So we all had the same idea of what we were trying to accomplish, and that certainly helps. The other is our values as a company. And we don't just talk about our values, we actually live them. And if you ask General Mills employees about the values and the company values, I guarantee you 90% of them, the first thing they would tell you is do the right thing all the time. That's what they would say. And now I think it would be followed by championing belonging. And so, in a sea of change, people always want to talk about the things that you change, but I think the first thing is what are the things that are going to remain constant, because when the wind is blowing, you need something to hold on to. And for us, that was our strategy and our values. And in the midst of the pandemic, one of the things that I think that we changed a lot was our behaviors and our attitudes. And General Mills has been a great company for a long, long time, since 1866, and for a lot of good things. But one of the things we would probably not have been known for is being particularly agile. And that's probably understating it. It's very much a knowing culture, and at least that's what it was. But when that pandemic hit, there wasn't really a playbook. There wasn't a lot to know, and one of the things I'm most proud of as a leadership team, that several of our leadership team members are here in the crowd today, we really switched from becoming a knowing culture to a learning culture. And that's really important, because when the future is so uncertain, which I would submit to you it is right now, when the future is uncertain, you need to provide clarity but not certainty. And we were very clear at the time when the pandemic hit, what are our priorities, and we had 3. And the first was keeping our employees safe, the second was keeping our consumers safe, and the third was providing food the world needs. Those were 3, and even when I talked to investors, I didn't talk about numbers or any of that. I just said, here are our 3 priorities. And And those things really served us well, and combine that with the strategy and the values, it really unleashed the power of the organization in a way that, to be honest, I never really could imagine.
Well, that's great. So one of the, earlier you had mentioned Blue Buffalo as a line and a brand that is a significant brand for you. And I want to stay with that for a minute, and then I want to ask a few follow-ups from other things you mentioned in that last answer.
Yeah.
In June, you told investors that Blue Buffalo is the #1 growth driver for General Mills.
Yeah.
So can you shed some light on the decision to acquire Blue Buffalo in 2018? Sort of what were you, what were the decision factors that you were considering then, and what do you see in the future for that particular brand?
Yeah, so we acquired the Blue Buffalo pet food brand for $8 billion. $8 billion in my first year as CEO. And the first thing I want you to know, it was not met with a great deal of confidence by the investor community at the time, as witnessed by the drop in our stock price and calls from a lot of retirees. And and I think that's an important thing, because we've doubled the size of the business, we've increased household penetration, we've doubled that, we've quadrupled the distribution. It's grown double digits, every year, but this last year it only grew at 9% this last year. So it's done really, really well, and it will into the future. But it was not met with a great deal of enthusiasm when we first bought it. But we bought it because we knew that as good as General Mills was, that we didn't have the amount of growth in our business that we really wanted to have sustainable growth. And we looked around at things we could acquire, and Blue Buffalo reminded us of a lot of the categories that we're currently in. I mean, people love their pets about as much as they love their kids. In fact, many times more so. And because pets always greet you warmly. I mean, unlike teenagers, pets always greet you warmly when you come in the house, and there are 2.5 times more pets than kids in the United States. And so people treat their pets like members of the family. We saw this big brand. And where a lot of other people saw pet food, we just saw another way to use our technology. The same technology we use to make dry pet food, we use to make breakfast cereal. The same technology we use to make wet pet food, we use to make soup and yogurt. It's called thermal processing technology. Mm-hmm. The distribution channels are about the same. We had done something with Annie's, and so something very similar with Annie's organic business a few years ago. And so we were really excited about it, and still are. And so we bought that business. It's been really successful. Like any business, it has ups and downs, and I'm sure this one will too. But that was a decision to make. And as I said, people were not wildly enthusiastic, when we did it, but they've come around. Sure. They've come around, and it's been a great addition to the General Mills family of brands.
Well, that's great. So speaking of the brands, as you've mentioned, and as I, illustrated with my wife's excitement about Pillsbury, General Mills has a portfolio of powerhouse brands. So how do you think about branding as a leader, and what's your approach to ensuring that those brands are relevant as longstanding brands, but are relevant to today's consumers?
Yeah, that is the question. It's a really important question. I mean, if you ask anybody at General Mills why they came, they'll tell you the people and the brands, and they'll tell you in that order. And if you ask people who have been around 29 years like I have, they'll say the same things. Mm-hmm. So we are a company of brands. And the thing is that, brands they live in the physical world, but they also live in the minds of consumers. And that's really where they make a big difference. And as people change over time, as attitudes change, as the context changes, brands are really living, breathing things. You need to change with the times if you're going to keep a brand relevant, while maintaining what that brand is all about. And that's the trick. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Cheerios was formed in 1941. And by the way, many good brands are formed in times of trouble. Mm. And Cheerios was no different. Wheaties was founded in the 1920s, right before the Great Depression. So Cheerios was started in 1941 as Cheerios, but it became Cheerios shortly thereafter. And it stands for nurturing. Cheerios has always been about nurturing, and it's the first solid food that most parents give their children. About 40% of Americans. It's the very first finger food. And it's because a lot of heads are nodding. It's fun to see the audience. People nod, yep, yeah, that was our household. And so it's been about nurturing for a long, long time. But, it turns out that the oats are also good for reducing cholesterol, mm-hmm. because they contain something called beta-glucan, and which is clinically proven to help reduce cholesterol. And so over time, not only is it the first finger food, but And not only do you take care of your family, but you can take care of yourself. And if you're taking care of yourself, you're taking care of your family. And so we introduced this cholesterol lowering message on Cheerios many, many years ago, and we still do. So in that way, Cheerios has maintained relevance. More recently, we've got a brand called Lucky Charms, which many of you have heard of. None of you will admit that you actually eat, but about a third of you do. And because people say, well, about half of consumption is Lucky Charms as adults. And people say, well, that's because I give it to my kids. That's baloney, because we also know that a third are households without kids.
Okay.
Okay. And so Lucky Charms, since it was launched in the 1960s, has always been magically delicious, and it still is. And it has nothing to do with its whole grain oats. It's all about the marshmallows. Okay, it's all about the marshmallows. But recently, one trend has been in food is to kind of miniaturize things, and so we recently launched Lucky Charms in a minis variety. And so in that sense, keeping it, and by the way, you get more marshmallows. They're smaller, but you get more. And so, we're keeping the brand fresh by keeping it relevant. We changed the marshmallows, and so Lucky Charms is a brand that's lived on and keeps growing. Not only because it tastes good, because it's still magically delicious, but it's magically delicious in a new way for every generation. Mm-hmm. So that's how you keep brands fresh. I mean, they don't just go on their own. You really have to nurture them. And General Mills and the team of marketers, several here in the crowd, they do it. They're the best in the world at what they do.
Well, guilty as charged.
Yeah. It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
If you want an intellectual alibi, the number one ingredient in Lucky Charms is whole grain.
All right, I'll
there
make
you
a
go.
note.
So,
well, you said a little bit earlier about the importance of agility, and so you've had 6 years as CEO, and part of what you've done is, worked with this nearly 160-year-old company to work on that agility, and you talked about moving from knowledge. Do you have any other lessons that you think you have learned along the way about agility that could apply to the business leaders in the room, regardless of their sector or the age of their business?
Yeah, well, I mean, agility, agility comes out. I talked about the need to have things that remain consistent, which is true. But in a world of change which we're facing, if you stand still and everything around you is changing, you're going to lose. And so that would be lesson number one. The second thing is, in a world that's so volatile, I find a number of people are trying to predict what's going to happen next, and of course they are. But it's almost impossible. You have a lot better chance of actually adjusting to what comes next than you are predicting. And one of the things we've done as a company, I'm really proud, the collective we, is that we haven't spent as much time as predicting as what is going to come next, but when we see something, trying to react faster than competition. Mm-hmm. And we've really we've changed our behaviors, a lot more productive discourse and dialogue and argument back and forth. And argument and tension can be a good thing if it's channeled in the right way, and we have some tension in a good way, in a healthy way. We've also changed the structure of our organization. We were very functionally oriented for decades, and we now have an organization that's more business-led with all the functions reporting into them. And you think that, well, that doesn't make a big difference, but I'm telling you, it makes a huge difference. And the way we're able to do pricing or supply chain decisions or marketing decisions, they're a lot faster than they were before. And a lot of that comes down to the structure of the organization, particularly in our North America retail organization. And John Nudi is here, and he runs that, and I give him a lot of credit for coming up with that. Mm-hmm. And it's made a huge difference in the agility of our biggest business. And so the ability, the knowledge that you need to change, and then the trusting your employees to do it, because it's amazing what happens when you set the guardrails and you free people who are really talented. And if you don't have people who are really talented, you better get some.
Sure. But
if you have people who are really talented and they know the command intent and they know the values of the company, I mean, unleashing that is unbelievable. It will, as a leader, it will generate more positive outcomes than you could have imagined, and that has been the case for us.
So you've mentioned earlier, and then you just mentioned how the values of the company are really important, and I want to dive into one of those that you mentioned previously. So right now there is a focus, and an overdue focus really, on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in society and in our workplaces. And I know that, as you've said, that's an important value at General Mills and for you personally. And you've said that one of those values is championing belonging.
Yeah.
And so how does that influence you as a leader and the culture at General Mills, and how has that idea of inclusion within that value evolved?
Yeah. So, you know, the great thing about the job I have is, I mean, I stand on the shoulders of leaders who before me believed in the value of a diverse and inclusive workplace. So I want you to know it didn't start with me. Our first female chemist at General Mills was hired in 1904.
Oh, wow.
The first female board of directors member was 1975, and we've had a person of color, a female on our board since that time. And so this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, it may be gaining steam with others, but at General Mills, it's been alive and well for many, many decades. So I want to start with that, with that caveat, and it does take a while, but it's a journey well worth it. As we think about the culture of belonging, you know, like most companies, we started with this idea of diversity, and in my view, diversity it's about numbers. It's about who's sitting around the table. And it's a prerequisite for belonging and inclusion. But it's not sufficient because diversity is important in its own right, because with diversity, you get a variety of points of view. And I teach a leadership class at DePaul University, and we talk about the Battle of Gettysburg and why the Army of Northern Virginia lost. And part of the reason was they weren't very diverse. And they all thought the same way. And so there's value in different types of thinking. There's also value in diversity because people want to look up and see people like them, because then they think, hey, I got a chance. I actually have a chance to make a difference here. So that's important, but it's not sufficient. And so then we started this journey toward inclusivity. And if diversity is about the numbers, inclusivity is about, do the people around the table actually have a voice? Because if there are numbers around the table, but they actually don't have a voice, it doesn't matter nearly as much. And so we started talking about inclusivity. And inclusivity is great too. I remember a leadership team meeting we had, it was a few years ago, when someone came up with an idea, and frankly, it wasn't a very good idea. And I shared with them that it wasn't a very good idea. And then someone else on our team said, yeah, that wasn't a very good idea, Jeff, you're right, but yours actually isn't very good either. And everybody looked at me like, okay, what's the leader gonna do now? And I said, well, what is the idea? And it was our general counsel at the time, Richard Allendorf. He said, well, here's the way I think we ought to think about it. And everyone looked around and like, yeah, that actually is the better idea of the three. And so, but we had this robust dialogue, and all of our opinions were considered. And so inclusivity is really important, but inclusivity is kind of an intellectual construct. So if diversity is about the numbers, inclusivity is intellectual. But what we've migrated to, which I think is really important, is belonging. And belonging is important for a couple reasons in my view. First of all, it's important because belonging is how you feel. Imagine a time where you felt like you belonged. And imagine what you'll do if you feel like you belong, especially if you belong to something you think is important. And we're human beings. We think we're rational. We are not. We're very emotional. That's why brands exist. Yeah. And so as human beings, the value of feeling like you belong is much more important than any intellectual construct. So that's important. But our value is about championing belonging. And everybody can do that. And imagine a time where you championed somebody else, where you made them feel welcome, or imagine when someone else made you feel welcome, and how that made you feel and how that made you engaged. And since we've developed this culture of belonging, since we've talked about championing belonging as our culture, what's interesting is that it's also not a zero-sum game. Anybody can belong. You talk about diversity, and sometimes people think it's a zero-sum game. If there are more women, then there are fewer men. If there are more people of color, then there are fewer white people. If there are more gay people, there are fewer straight people. And people do this math in their head, and it doesn't actually work that way, but that's what people think. But with belonging, it raises all ships. Everybody wants to belong. Everybody wants to feel as if they belong. And so what we've seen is that our engagement scores are at the company. We measure engagement of our employees. They're as high as they've ever been. And by the way, they've grown across all categories of people. Gay people, straight people, white people, black people, tall people, short people, they've grown across the spectrum. And so I'm really proud of that. And that's why, in my view, this championing belonging is so important. And we all know in society now there are great debates about race and wokeness and all those other things. But I mean, I'd love to get into a debate with somebody about belonging. You tell me that feeling like you belong doesn't matter. I think that's a debate I feel confident I would win. Yeah.
So how do you foster that culture of championing belonging within your organization? Do you have training, programming? How do you go about permeating that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that people pay attention to what you say. They pay a lot more attention to what you do. And if you look at our board of directors, you would say, hey, look, that's a very diverse group. If you looked at our leadership team, you would say that's a very diverse group. It's also an inclusive group. But we also practice belonging. So the first thing I would say is that leadership casts the long shadows, and your employees are always looking at the top, not about what you say, because you can say all the right things, but what they're really watching is what do you do. And so that's where it starts. The second thing, you have to say it out loud. You can't run away from it. We included it in our values. And when I say we, I'm not the one who actually brought this idea of belonging. We had a group of employees, we were talking about refreshing our values. They brought this idea. All I had to do is look at it and go, yeah, right on, that's powerful. And now I get to talk to you about it as if I came up with the whole thing. I did not. A group of employees came up with it. And so it really starts there. But we also have courageous conversations. And we've had them on a whole number of topics, from mental health to interaction between police and people of color. We had one employee whose son was a police officer, and another person of color had a bad interaction with police. We had them on stage and we talked about it. And we don't let these things fester. And so having these courageous conversations, I think, brings out the humanity in people, and realize it's a culture in which you can talk about the things that are different, the things that are stressful, because we all know they're there. And the only question is, are you going to ignore it, or are you going to do something about it? And so that's what, and once you start to get the ball rolling, everybody wants to feel like they belong, and they want to feel like other people belong. Mm-hmm. I believe people are generally good. Yep. There are always bad ones, but people are generally good. And so that's kind of how but it has to start with a leadership group who actually believes it. And I'm fortunate enough to have a team that believes in that.
Well, so speaking of culture, all of us, and culture at work in particular, all of us are still figuring out work post-pandemic, in the office and remotely. And as I understand it, you at General Mills have a hybrid approach to work. So how's that working for you, and what factors do you use to evaluate the success of that approach?
Yeah, well, first of all, business results. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're not doing this just for fun. I mean, we're trying to trying to sell more stuff and make more money and do good in our community and all that. So, I mean, the business results, but also engagement. Mm-hmm. Our engagement scores are really high. Our worker productivity is really high. And what's been interesting is that I recently saw that Zoom was mandating people come back to the office. That kind of struck me as kind of humorous. Maybe a bit ironic, but killing their own business model, I guess. But so we've kind of taken an approach, and we call it work with heart. We've branded it because that's what we do. Yeah. And the G has a big heart on it. And we've told people we want them to come in for moments that matter, and creating moments that matter. And so we've redone some of our corporate headquarters to make it workspace that people want to work in. We create moments that people really care about. We have a New Year meeting every July because our fiscal year starts in June. We had 70% more people on site this year than we did last year. Mm-hmm. 70. And we didn't tell people they had to come in. We just created a moment that mattered for them. And so what we're finding is that more people are coming back to the office more often, and we haven't mandated anything. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that if you treat people like adults, then they act like adults. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're doing. I know it's kind of maybe controversial, but that's how we're approaching it. And people say, well, maybe some people at home aren't working as hard. Well, I'm sure that's the case, but we all know people who come to the office don't work very hard either. I mean, there are people, you walk around like, how many cups of coffee is that guy going to get? I mean, so there's always somebody who's not working as hard as they should be. But we have found that by treating people that way, providing some flexibility, employees pay it back. I think our employees are working harder than they ever have. But they're, sometimes they need to pick up a kid at 3, so they leave at 2:30. Sometimes they need to take somebody in the morning, or a doctor's appointment, or someone in the family. And so we just find that the expectations remain high. So it's not a lowering of expectations, but giving a little bit of flexibility helps. Having said that, it's also very clear that people learn from other people, especially the young employees. So having no people in the office, I think that would be a huge mistake. Mm-hmm. I think that would, not only just for the culture, but just for learning. And I've got a 22-year-old and a 24-year-old, and I can tell you, they learn much better when their manager is close by, so they don't waste a whole day on doing something they wish they wouldn't have done it, did it in the wrong way. So the idea of being in person is really important, but giving some flexibility is also important. By the way, we're not in an end state yet. We're still pretty close to the pandemic fire, in my view. Sure. And this will continue to evolve as technology evolves, and we'll see if we get further away from the fire what happens. But I think it'll continue to evolve, but I really am appreciative of the approach that we're taking. And Jacqueline Williams-Roll, who's our CHRO, has been the champion of that, and she's been right. We've had rigorous debates, among the leadership team over time about what we should do, and we've stayed the course, and that's been the right course for us.
Great. So I have a question that is short, but weighty.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So
it's usually those you're like, okay, now I'm bracing myself.
No. I think everybody in the audience will be really interested in hearing what you have to say about this. So, what is the most important thing you as a leader can do to drive positive change?
Well, I think first of all, if you're, it's not going to be turned into a sermon, I promise you. But if you want to be a leader, someone has to follow. Otherwise, you're actually not leading. I mean, and people don't follow people they don't trust. And they don't follow dreams. They don't follow strategic plans. I can tell you that. And they probably don't follow plans of any sort. But people follow people. So if you want to be an effective leader, the most important thing you can do is engender trust. And I don't know people don't follow people they don't trust. They don't follow people who aren't authentic. And my brother is also a CEO of a publicly traded company, and he and I are pretty different personalities, but one thing we have in common, we're both authentic. And some of the stuff he does, there's no way I could get away with. And there's some things that I do that it wouldn't be authentic to him, but we both lead in that way. And so in terms of leading change, the first thing I would say as a leader, you have to be authentic to who you are, because then you have a chance. The second is that I think you have to believe that change is important. And in an environment this dynamic, I can't imagine not being interested in change. And I guess the third as a leader is that you don't have to know everything, which is good because you will not know everything. And that's why it's a team sport. And we hired a chief data and technology officer because we didn't have somebody who knew that. We just hired someone into our talent organization because we needed someone to do that. We hired someone from the outside to do supply chain because we needed to improve on that. I mean, I'm not an expert in HR, Jacqueline is. John Nudie runs the North America Retail Organization. He does a better job than I could ever do at that. So, Doug Martin, we talked about brands. Doug is a phenomenal brand builder. Yeah, I did marketing. He's a way better marketer than I am. So, if you're gonna affect change, you have to be willing to change, and you have to be willing to let people do what they do best. And not only, you have to have confidence. You have to have some degree of confidence and a fair amount of humility, because you're also going to get some things wrong. I've never seen a company or a person change where some of it you don't go back later and go, that didn't work. And then you have to go back and say, okay, how do we fix it? So I've probably given you a whole lunch there. But those are a few things I think in leading change that are important.
All right. I'm going to ask you a question now that I asked my son, who is a recent college graduate, 22 years old, last night.
Right.
I think he gave the correct answer. So I want to ask you.
We'll see if I get it right.
What is the most popular General Mills cereal on all U.S. campuses?
I might phone a friend, but I will see if I get this right. We have a really good cereal business on college campuses. We have 6 of the top 7 cereals on college campuses, yes. And now you're all wondering, okay, which one don't you have? The answer is Fruit Loops. All right, the answer is Fruit Loops. All right, so we're done with that. We have all of the business at the University of Minnesota.
Okay.
Yep.
Very good.
And the top one for many, many years has been Lucky Charms. I'm pretty sure that it still is. And if it's not, it's because Cinnamon Toast Crunch has overtaken it.
I think that's right.
And the guy who led the development of Cinnamon Toast Crunch is sitting in the chair right over here.
All right.
So I got a shout out to that. So, yeah.
So I do think it's Cinnamon Toast Crunch.
Yes.
All right, so that's important, but moving to another question about because we're on a college campus and we have probably some students in the audience and definitely people who mentor and advise and supervise students and young professionals. Mm-hmm. What is one piece of career advice that you have for students or new professionals that will set them apart as they launch into their careers?
Wow, one piece. That's a high bar. I'll give you a couple thoughts, and it's kind of like multiple choice. Then you can pick which one you like, or talk to somebody about which one you like. The first, I guess, piece of career advice I would say is, spend time with people you like to spend time with. And I know it's cliche, but it's true. And some jobs you'll like more than others, but no job will be terrible if you actually like the people that you work with. And I love the people at General Mills. I always have. So, the second piece of advice I would give, especially young college graduates, is that the first job is all about learning, and it's about learning. What do you like, what do you not like, and almost nobody ends their career in the exact same job they started in.
Sure.
And so, what is it you like about that job? What do you don't like? So, in the next job you have, you can get closer to something that you like and farther away from stuff that you don't like, and that would be my second piece of career advice. The third would be is that you don't have to be a CEO or a senior leader to lead. I know a lot of senior executives who actually aren't leaders. Fortunately, none of them work at General Mills, but there are a lot of people in positions of power who actually aren't very good leaders. And so people get confused with positional authority and leadership. You can lead even if you're starting out, and leadership can mean having a voice, thinking about things differently, speaking truth to power. I mean, those are things that, yes, you have to do some of these things respectfully, but leadership doesn't start when you get a badge that says you're a vice president. You start leading before somebody recognizes you're a leader. And if you do that, you'll make a difference in whatever job you're in, and somebody will eventually notice. By the way, it might not be your first boss. They might not be paying attention. But eventually the cream rises to the top, and somebody will notice the talent you have if you're making a difference and a positive effect wherever you're working. That's what I would tell. And that's the advice I've given my 22-year-old and 24-year-old, and we'll see if they take it. I mean, sometimes your kids don't like to take your own advice. So.
Sure. All right, so thank you so much for that conversation. I want to turn it over to the audience, and Amy has a microphone, and my team has told me that Mark always asks the first question, so I'm going to let Mark take it away.
All right.
Thank you. This was a great presentation. Thanks a lot. I wanted to know, we've talked about change, we've talked about COVID, and we've talked about a lot of the great things General Mills does. That's true. What do you think in the 166 years is the one or two business practices that, number one, keep employees interested and keep coming back for more, that send General Mills out in the community, and so on and so forth? You've done a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. I heard part of that question, but not all of it. I want to make sure I don't answer the wrong question. Could you?
Yes, he's asking, over the 166 years of General Mills being a company, what is the one piece or one
piece that has kept the employees?
Oh, what is the one piece that's been keeping employees coming back and the positivity in the community?
Yeah, that's a very relevant question. I think it is the impact we have on community and the way we think about our business. And I'm going to go back to 1878. And many of you have probably been to the Mill City Museum. But flour is very flammable, as it turns out, and it certainly was in 1878 because the flour mill blew up. And when it blew up, there were a couple of important things that happened. First of all, Cadwallader Washburn decided to rebuild it, which he didn't have to do. Many people would not have; they just would have walked away. He decided to rebuild it. The second is, it was a really tragic event. 18 people lost their lives, and it created orphans, and so he also took care of the families of those who were killed and created an orphanage out of that. But the third thing that he did was he scoured the world for ways to make flour production safer. And he actually found it in Europe and brought it back to the US. But importantly, more important than making it safer, so that's good. I mean, he cares about his employees, that's a good bar. But he kind of raised it one more, and he said, our competitive advantage is not the safety of our employees. And so he gave that technology to all his competitors. Because we will compete on the basis of the quality of our flour and how we distribute it and the brand gold medal, but we will not compete on the basis of safety. And he gave that to all his competitors. That's the underlying spirit of General Mills. And if you ask kind of what's still true today as it was then, we're not having flour mills that blow up, so that's good. But the commitment to employees, the commitment to community, to the commitment to doing the right thing all the time, which is kind of our underlying value. I think it stems from 1878, and I think it's carried all the way through today. And that may manifest itself in things like regenerative agriculture, which we're really big on today, or education, or how we feel about inclusivity or belonging in the workplace. I think it all stems back to that, and it also shows that when you do acts of extraordinary good, which they did in 1878, how far into the future that plays. We're still talking about it. It's almost it's almost 160 years later, and we're still talking about it. So that's why I think employees come. I think that's the most important reason people come to General Mills, and I think that's the most important reason they stay, because they want to have people. They want to be around people who share the kind of values that they share.
Great, thank you so much. We've got a question from our virtual audience.
The question is, do you still have a relationship with Nestle in the cereal category?
Yeah, so do we still have a relationship with Nestle in the cereal category? And the short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is we have a joint venture to sell breakfast cereal outside of North America with Nestle. It's a 50-50 joint venture, 50% owned by them, 50% owned by General Mills. I'm actually the co-chair of that board. There's a co-chair at Nestle. We had John Nudi's also here. He's a member of that board. Kofi Bruce as well. And it's been a joint venture that's 30 years in the making. And what we realized 30 years ago, General Mills realized that it had a lot of cereal capability, but was like 50 years behind. I mean, literally 50 years behind Kellogg's outside the U.S. So we didn't think we could catch up. Nestle was trying to do cereal. They had no idea what they were doing, by their own admission. They had no idea what they were doing, but they had the means and the infrastructure to do it. And so literally, the two chairs of the companies talked 30 years ago, and in 3 weeks, they came up with this joint venture agreement that lives today on one piece of paper. And they created this 50-50 joint venture, and it combines the marketing and R&D prowess of General Mills with the sales infrastructure and manufacturing of Nestle to compete on cereal globally. And now it's over a $2 billion business outside the U.S. and gone from 0 share to about 25 share points in that 30 years. It's pretty spectacular, and most joint ventures fail. Well, you teach business, you know this. Most telling you stuff you know, but most joint ventures fail because a company has a bad business, another company has a bad business, and they're hoping by some act of God or something that you put them together and they become better, and it turns out no. 1 and 1 makes 1.5, but in this case, 1 and 1 has been 3.
That's great.
So yes.
Thank you. You've talked about how important learning is, and what I am seeing in people, certainly the next generation, but also in people in general, is that folks are less likely to ask questions. They Google things, they figure things out for themselves, but that takes time and is a solitary experience. How can we support people to feel good asking questions, making mistakes, and living in that learning culture that you were talking about?
So there is an echo in here. It's kind of hard to hear, but my take on it was, how can we help people feel good about learning and asking questions and learning together rather than in a solitary way? That is the role of the leader. First of all, that's the role of the leader. That's the role of the leader. And you'll find out pretty crowded, even in a crowd like this, a very accomplished crowd like this, someone will ask the first question, and based on how the person responds, you either get a second, third, fourth, and fifth question, or it's crickets. I mean, those are the options. And so, the first thing I would say, how do we get employees to learn together? It's the importance of the leader, first of all, to listen. To listen. That's why I've asked you to repeat the questions, because I couldn't exactly hear them, and I want to be empathetic, and I want to listen to the questions that you're asking, and to be able to respond to those questions in a way that is helpful. But also, sometimes as a leader, you're learning yourself. I mean, my kids teach me a lot about technology, like a lot, and I have a lot to learn. So I think it's incumbent upon creating an environment where asking questions is okay, and a learning culture rather than a knowing culture. And that's one of the things we spend a lot of time at General Mills, is developing a learning culture where you don't have to have the right answer all the time. But I love a good question. And it's incumbent upon us as the people managing people coming into the workforce to have a degree of patience and to have a listening and learning mindset so that we can actually teach them and respond to their questions. And sometimes the answer as a leader is, I have no idea. I don't know. I found myself saying that a lot in the last 3 years because of a pandemic. And how do you respond to George Floyd's murder? I mean, sometimes the answer is I don't know. I mean, you don't have a great answer, and in that process, you learn a lot as well.
All right, Steve's got one from our virtual audience.
It's another short one, Jeff. What keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night? I actually sleep pretty well. I mean, I've got a sleep number bed, and my score's pretty high. You know, we know that there's change going on in the world around us, and you know, one of the job as a leader is to look around corners. I mean, that's one of the most important things I do. I mean, people ask a lot of times, what do you do as CEO? And the answer is not too much. I look around corners, I create strategy, I hire good people, I got a phenomenal leadership team, and I let them run. That's kind of, and then I monitor it to make sure we're doing what we say we're going to do. That's kind of my job. What keeps me up at night is a lot of times you look around corners and all you see is another corner. You know, especially today. And so that keeps me up at night because I feel it's my responsibility as the CEO of the organization to see around as many corners as possible so that the rest of the team can do what they do. And, you know, sometimes you get nervous. You're going to look around the corner. You don't know what you're going to see. Look at ChatGPT. I mean, who saw it? I didn't see that coming. And now that it's here, I'm not exactly sure what it's going to do. And so those are the things that keep me up at night, which is trying to make sure that that I'm staying ahead of the game. And so I do a lot of reading. As a leader, I do a lot of reading. I read a lot of different things. I tell people when there's still magazines, I think I'm the only person in the world who had a subscription to The Economist and People at the same time because I want to know what's going on in the world in terms of economics and geopolitics. But like, what are the people? What are your average everyday person walking on? What's on their mind? You know, how much do they care about the Kardashians? I mean, a lot more than it turns out you think they probably should. And so looking around a lot of different aspects, I spend a lot of time doing that because I want to make sure that if there's a corner that I can see around, that I have the best chance to do it.
All right, we've got our final question here.
Thank you. My question is around belonging.
Yes.
So how do you ensure that what is being spoken of in the C-suite trickles down, those middle managers? Because I'm thinking our kids that are entering the workforce, I don't want them to see belonging as another DE&I buzzword. So how are you ensuring that it trickles down and middle management, everybody makes sure everybody belongs?
Yeah, so that's outstanding, and I hate buzzwords. I really do, and I don't like strategies or values that are just written on a piece of paper. Either we're doing it or we're not doing it. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, it's kind of that simple. And so with belonging, we measure it. I mean, you know, what gets measured gets done. I mean, and so people think, well, it's just a whole touchy-feely thing. I mean, yeah, it's emotional, but that doesn't mean you can't quantify as well. So so first thing I would say is trust but verify. And so we do engagement surveys from time to time, and we ask employees, you know, how do they feel about their level of engagement? How do they feel about? Do they feel that General Mills is a place for them? And we ask it a lot, and we cut the data in lots of different ways. We know it by ethnicity, we know it by gender. We don't know people individually. Okay, so it's not that. But you know, in big data sets, we know, and we know by location what people are thinking. And so we measure it across the board, and we measure it relatively frequently, at least a couple times a year, to make sure that we have the plot. And what I'm pleased to say is that regardless of the function of the company you work in, or the geography, or the color of your skin, or your gender, or your sexual orientation, I mean, people feel pretty similar. They feel like they belong, and I know that quantitatively. And so, and we keep measuring it. And if it turns out one day that we're not doing as well as we want, then we'll take corrective actions. We'll talk about it as a senior leadership team because we own it. And then but we want to make sure that whatever problem we're solving that specific problem. I don't want to confuse activity with accomplishment. No points for activity, no points. Only points for accomplishment. And so if it turns out that we're not getting the job done in a certain area, For example, black managers. We don't have enough black managers at General Mills. We have some specific initiatives to generate more black managers because we think it's important. And so that's how we go about ensuring. Now, you did say everyone. What I would tell you is that, so our engagement scores are high. The percentage of people that feel as if they belong at General Mills is like 91%. I mean, it's really high. But there's still 9 that don't. And so I would also say, if you're trying, the pursuit of having everyone get on board, it's a noble pursuit. You just have to realize that it's not going to happen, and you have to be careful. You don't cater to the 5% or the 9%. You cater to the 91. And if there's some people who are never going to get on that bus, then they need to find another bus sometime. But you can't spend too much of your time worried about the few people who do not have the plot, and you're catering to the majority who actually do have the plot, and lift them up. So I'm looking at my teammate who are going, okay, am I on track here? Okay, good. All right.
Well, I think that is an excellent place to stop. I think I want to just thank you so much, Jeff, for being here today, for sharing your thoughts about your experience, your leadership at General Mills. And I know I learned a lot today. I'm sure that everyone in the audience learned a lot as well. And so I want to thank you for your time.
Well, thank you. And I want you to know, thank you. And as a part of the Minnesota business community, I want to welcome you here. I mean, Indiana's a great state, and so is Minnesota.
Absolutely.
And welcome to the University of Minnesota.
Thank you.
We get more recruits from the University of Minnesota than any other university.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
That's great.
You can have that magnet.
All right. So I want to thank everyone here at McNamara who was in attendance today, and I also want to thank those who joined us on virtually on Zoom. And I hope all of you can join us for our next session on September 5th for our first Tuesday event, where we'll be joined by Daryl German, who is the regional president for Minnesota of Huntington National Bank. So thank you to everyone again for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great time.